Thank you so much, Chad. It's a huge honor and privilege to be kicking off today with a keynote and this day of conversation and invention. So thank you for inviting me to be part of this. And it's a great way to start the day with a really big picture. So I want to pull back and think about the beginning of the 21st century as a whole. And I'm going to share my screen with you because the 21st century has begun with multiple crises. Back in 2008, countries worldwide saw financial meltdown. We are living in an era of climate and ecological breakdown. And then this past year and still on, we are experiencing worldwide in many different ways the strictures of COVID lockdown. And these crises clearly strike people with sharp inequalities of gender and of race, of wealth and of power between the global north and the global south. But what they have in common and what we have in common is a recognition of how deeply interconnected we are between each other worldwide and humanity with the rest of the living world. For me, these three crises that seem incredibly different in origin and impact actually all have a very strong underlying feature, which is that they all have arisen from the ongoing 20th century project, which presumes that humanity thrives through endless expansion. So create a financial system that aims to endlessly expand, and you kick off a subprime mortgage crisis. Create an industrial system that happily depends upon an endless expansion of fossil fuel use and material use, and you engender climate and ecological breakdown. You get a boomerang effect back from planet Earth telling us this is not okay. Create a human system where we endlessly expand human areas into wildlife areas, and we are endlessly increasing our travel between nations through flying. And you create conditions for zoonotic diseases to turn into a health crisis and become a global pandemic. So these crises arise from the very systems we've created, which are dependent upon endless expansion. They also are a deep threat to human well-being and huge risk of massive setback and irreversible change. So to my mind, these tell us we urgently need to transform the paradigms, the visions in our minds of what success looks like. And I believe it is not endless growth. The 21st century vision of success must look far more like moving into a donut. Crazy that may sound. I want to tell you about this concept of the donut. So imagine humanity's use of Earth's resources radiating out from the middle of this picture. It means that the hole in the middle of the donut there, that's a place where people are left falling short on the essentials of life. It's where people don't have the food, water, healthcare, education, housing, political voice, gender equality, social equity that every person has a claim to. I can say that because I've drawn these 12 social dimensions from the Sustainable Development Goals. So all the world's governments have already agreed that all people in the world have a claim to meeting these essential needs. Leave no one falling short on that social foundation. Get everyone into the donut. That was almost a 20th century project. And actually the belief that growing economies put money in the hands of workers who then can meet their families' needs, in some ways underpinned that. But this century, we know more. We now know that we depend upon Earth's life-supporting systems to provide us with a stable climate, with fertile soils and abundant biodiversity, with recharging fresh water, with a protective ozone layer overhead. And therefore, we know that we cannot expand humanity's use of Earth's resources beyond that point, that ecological ceiling where we begin to put so much pressure on Earth's life-supporting systems that we kick them out of balance. And there we cause climate breakdown. We acidify the oceans. We create a hole in the ozone layer. We create catastrophic biodiversity loss and break down the web of life. And these around the outside of the 9 planetary boundaries first recognized by Earth system scientists only just over a decade ago. I mean, this is incredibly recent understanding, and we are still in the process of taking it on board into our paradigms and our deep understanding of what human well-being therefore looks like, and how we must redesign our institutions and our economies in the light of this new understanding. So bring these two together. The aim here of the Doughnut is to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. Don't fall short on the social foundation, don't overshoot the ecological ceiling, but thrive in that green ring itself that is regenerative and distributive. It's a safe and just space for humanity. Now, if that becomes the goal, suddenly the shape of progress is incredibly different. It's no longer ever rising growth, endless expansion. It's balance, almost like a heartbeat. We need to find that balance. And that totally transforms the language, the metaphors, and the direction of what progress looks like. Right now, we are far out of that balance. All of the red here shows you the extent to which humanity is falling short on the essentials of life. All of the red in the middle tells us, for example, 11% of people worldwide don't have enough food to eat every day. That's that a little red wedge going 11% of the way on food towards the center of the circle. 1 person in 3 doesn't have access to what we call a toilet. 1 person in 9 doesn't have access to clean, improved water sources. But on every social dimension, there are people worldwide falling short. And at the same time, we collectively have already overshot multiple planetary boundaries. We're in overshoot on climate. That ceiling is at 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. We're way over, on over 415. We are over on excessive fertilizer use, nitrogen, phosphorus. We're over on biodiversity loss. We're over on land conversion. We don't even know where we are on chemical pollution and air pollution. So humanity is in this double whammy of falling short and in overshoot at the same time. This is where our systems have been taking us. We need to transform. Let me take it down from this global story down to a national picture. Here are just 3 very different nations and their national donuts. So at one end, we have Malawi, as you can see, significantly falling short on almost all of those social foundations, that red in the center of the circle, but not overshooting its fair share of pressure on any one of those planetary boundaries. How does Malawi transform so that it meets people's needs without overshooting the planet? In the middle, we have China, which, like many countries, is both falling short on social foundations and already quite significantly in overshoot on the planet. And then over on the other side, we have Norway, one of the few countries that has, on this very low, globally comparable bar, met its social foundations, but is in very significant overshoot on planetary boundaries. And as you can see, there's a dotted line around the outside here. That's because these diagrams actually show cutoffs. Let me show the full reveal. This is the full difference between Malawi, China, and Norway. And we can see these countries are living at very, very different levels of income per capita. So now let me take these 3 and put them in a picture of over 100 countries. So the place you want to be is in that top left-hand corner, where any nation meets the needs of all of its people, but does so within the means of the planet. And as you can see, there's no country that can say it's there. To me, this picture tells us that we are all developing countries now. There's not a country in the world I can think of that can put its hand up and say, we're developed. So I invite everybody actually to take the word developed countries out of your vocabulary, because there aren't any. When we reconceive what human well-being looks like, we are all developing countries now. Of course, in very different situations. So there's the low-income countries that have to meet the needs of their people for the first time, but are hardly putting any pressure on the planet. How do they do that? How do they do that without following the path that every country before them has taken? There's the middle income and sometimes called emerging economies that have that double whammy of still needing to meet the majority of their people's needs for the first time, but already need to come back within planetary boundaries. That's not been done before. How do you get on that trajectory? And then there's the high income countries, those countries that so far have been called developed, but we're removing that word now because they have, as the others, an unprecedented transformation to make, an unprecedented journey in reducing their impact on the planet, coming back within planetary boundaries on carbon, on the material footprint, on land use, water use, on pollution, on fertilizer use, while sustaining and indeed achieving for the first time good conditions for all of their people. So to me, this picture tells us that every country in the world needs an unprecedented level of humility in that we are all making transformations we've never made, but also unprecedented ambition in the intention to get there, so that humanity can, as one, thrive within the means of the planet. And lastly, of course, these countries may be dots separated on the screen, but they are deeply interconnected through their histories and current power relations. So let's acknowledge that fully, particularly the relationship of most of these high-income countries to the rest, the histories of colonialism and the extraction that brought, and the long legacy that still holds, the histories of structural adjustment policies imposed upon far lower income countries to open up their economies and their borders, the current practice of debt and of trade rules that locks many low income countries into inescapable financial bondage. Resource extraction, which happens today through foreign direct investment, through land grabs, through multinationals that are continually extracting resources from lower and middle income countries. And of course, the deep irony and injustice that the climate change impacts generated by the richest countries in the world fall first and hardest and most drastically on the poorest and least equipped countries. And therefore, these countries are deeply intertwined. And as we create solutions of moving towards the donut, these interconnecting challenges also must be taken into account. So I've gone from the global donut to the national donut. I want to bring it down one more level. And I'm going to come down to the level of the city, because many people feel a real connection to the cities they live in. And I'm going to use for the rest of this presentation the level of the city, but I want you to listen to what I say to not only through cities, you can imagine it through the level of a country, or indeed through a business. So what would it mean for a city to thrive within the donut, for a city to put itself on track to meeting the needs of all people within the means of the planet? Well, we've been working with the C40, with circular economy and biomimicry 3.8 at Doughnut Economics Action Lab. We've been working together with several cities to explore this question. And I want to share it now with you. Here's the question we invite every ambitious 21st century city to ask itself. How can our city be a home to thriving people in this thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? Now, inside that complex question, there are 4 questions. Let's go through them. First of all, what would it mean for the people of our city to thrive? Who are the people of this city where you are? In their full diversity, recognizing the diversity of their experiences, their wealth, their power, their culture, their histories, their values. What would it mean for the people of this city to thrive? Only the people of that city can say so. And where are you now in relation to that goal? Secondly, what would it mean for this city to thrive within its natural habitat? So where on planet Earth is your town or city or village located? Everywhere is in a unique part of Earth's biomes, at the top of a plateau, in the bottom of a valley, in a forest, a savanna, a desert, a wetland. And in each of these places, nature thrives differently. Nature has a genius of adapting to place. And in every place, nature is sequestering carbon dioxide. She's storing groundwater after a storm. She's housing biodiversity. She's cooling the air from the treetops to the forest floor. What if your city took the genius of nature from the wild land next door to where you are and said, let that be the metric of ecological performance for our city in the 21st century? And this comes from the work of Janine Benyus, who created what are called ecological performance standards. So let's go to the wildland next door, the healthiest intact habitat of nature where you are, and measure how much she sequesters carbon and stores groundwater and houses biodiversity and cools the air and forms soil, and take those as the metrics for your city. How could your city sequester carbon, draw it down instead of releasing it? How could your city cool the air instead of suffering from urban heat islands? How could your city house biodiversity? How could it collect groundwater and store it under the pavements instead of having flash flooding? These are ecological design ambitions for a 21st century city. So these 2 I've covered are the local aspirations to be thriving people in this thriving place. And that all happens where you are in your city. But we all know that every city is deeply interconnected with the whole world, with the people and ecological resources worldwide, and draws upon them, draws them in, and therefore must take responsibility. So we set this local aspiration in the context of global responsibility, and also ask, what would it mean for your city to respect the health of the whole planet? As you saw, all of high income countries and the cities within them are massively overshooting their impact on planetary boundaries, as well as many middle income cities and countries. So what would it mean for them to come back? This means creating a circular economy. This means reducing material use in the first place. And many strategies are required to do that. And then lastly, let's think of these supply chains of food and clothing and electronics goods and consumer goods and construction materials coming to your city, not only thinking of the material flow and impact of that, but also the people working at the end of those supply chains, who's picking and packing your clothing, who's stitching and transporting and assembling your electronic goods, who's digging and mining those construction materials. What would it mean for your city to respect the well-being of people worldwide and the workers in those global supply chains? And how can your city procure and purchase in ways that respect people's rights worldwide? These are big questions. Of course they are, because these are big times. But these are the questions that we invite cities to take on board and look for the interconnections between these four very different lenses of living in the donut. In fact, we've piloted this work with the cities of Amsterdam, Portland, and Philadelphia. And here are some workshops we ran at the end of 2019 in each of those cities with policymakers and community members, some representing education, some sewage, some transport, some equality, some housing, meeting together and looking at the interconnections of their work. And you can see in the way they're engaging, they're beginning to make connections that they hadn't seen before. So a holistic, integrated form of policymaking. What are the big picture stories that come out and the imperatives that this leads us to? I believe there are two fundamental transformations that need to be put in place if cities are going to start bringing humanity into that space that meets the needs of all within the means of the planet. And the first transformation from 20th century design to 21st century design is to shift from being degenerative by design, that take, make, use, lose, linear degenerative economy, which runs down the sources of life on this planet, and transform it into a regenerative or cyclical or circular economy in which resources are never used up, but are used again and again and repaired, refurbished, restored. This is an economy that works with and within the cycles of the living world. One of those cycles, of course, being the carbon cycle, and it's time to draw down that carbon as we create regenerative economies. Some examples of cities that are introducing regenerative by design, and these are mere illustrations of many, many possibilities. In the city of Curitiba, it was one of the forerunners of creating rapid transit so that buses run freely, fast, they're efficient, they're affordable. It makes more sense to take public transport than private transport. This is the beginnings of a city that actually cuts its traffic emissions. And of course, now Curitiba are now moving over to electric buses. The city of Paris, like many others over the past year, have used the COVID crisis to redraw the lines on the city streets and make much more space for cyclists, again, enabling that transformation of transport for the local residents and citizens. In the city of Amsterdam, building regulations are changing. They're bringing in a circular strategy in the city, aiming to halve the use of new materials, cut it by 50% by 2030. That's ambitious. And so buildings like this one, the Circle building, if you look carefully, you can see most of it is made from wood and metal, and nothing is glued and cemented together. Everything is clipped and bolted and screwed together so that it can be unclipped and unbolted and used again and again. This is a building that's built to be disbuilt, reassembled, reused in the future. And of course, by being built from timbers, it's sequestering carbon within the body of the very building. And then in the city of Medellin in Colombia, recognizing that the city is placed somewhere on nature's biome. Many cities in the last century covered over their rivers or treated them as industrial sewers. And Medellin, as other places, is saying, actually, the river is not an industrial sewer. It's an ecological, biological flow of life through our city. Let's open the river up. Let's make it a place that people go. Let's bring back nature and healthy flow at the heart of our city. So these are just 4 examples of regenerative design. Along with regenerative design, though, we need another transformation. And that other transformation is to shift from economies and cities that lead to divisive designs. Divisive in the sense that they drive opportunity and value into the hands of a few. Opportunity to live in a good place, opportunity to make a good living, opportunity to feel like you're thriving in your city. We need to create cities and economies that are distributive of opportunity and value, far more equitably with everybody who co-creates it. What does that look like? Well, if we want to be distributive by design, again, just some illustrations. The city of Preston in the UK is known as a leader in creating community-led organizations and using the power, the purchasing power of anchor institutions, the city administration, the schools, the hospitals, to purchase locally, to build local links with small and medium enterprises, and to enable the rise of small locally owned enterprises. In many countries, they're ensuring that this is done with ethnic minority communities getting strong support to build their enterprises too. So it's got a race and gender intention as well of inclusion behind building small businesses. In Vienna, the vast majority of people, over 60% of people in the city of Vienna, live in housing that is owned by the city or by cooperatives run by the city. And that housing is affordable, which means that public housing, which in some cities is seen as a really rundown state of affairs, public housing in Vienna is great housing. It's beautiful. And you get to live in the center of the city. It's affordable. It makes city life much more equitable. So in terms of the sheer cost of housing, it makes a big difference. In the city of Seattle, it was one of the first in the US to introduce a living wage, $15 an hour. At first, people said, well, $15 an hour, we won't even be able to afford to go to restaurants anymore. Actually, the effect was that even the wait staff in restaurants could now go to restaurants. And across the world, research has shown that introducing a living wage does not undermine jobs in the ways that some people had said it would do. So ensuring a decent income for people working at the bottom, and there are many of them key workers who we've become highly aware of in this past year due to COVID. And then distributive by design in terms of public space. Let us create public luxury, not private luxury, luxury that's distributive. Again, in Colombia, the city of Bogota turned car parks like this one into public spaces, transforming that use of public space into somewhere that people can meet, connect, raise their kids, have community. So to me, these are four beautifully diverse examples of distributive design. We need to create cities and national economies that put these principles into practice, from degenerative to regenerative, from divisive to distributive. These are the dynamics that will bring humanity into the donut. We also need to rethink our economic identities. We can recognize that the economy is embedded in society, embedded in the living world. The economy is a social construct. We invented it and we can reinvent it, but it must live and work within the laws of nature, the laws of thermodynamics, within Earth's cycles of carbon and water and the web of life. It must be compatible with that. But let's look within the economy itself. Often when people think of the economy or teach economics, they immediately start with the market and say, well, who we show up as in economics is rational economic man. We're either the consumer or the producer. We're shopping or working, or labor or capital. But this is just one aspect of our nature. And the character that we're given, rational economic man, and we're told is individualistic, self-interested, money-oriented, ever calculating. Actually, the best business is never done that way. But we need to diversify away from thinking of ourselves only in the economy in this role as consumer and producer. We also need to recognize our role in relation to the state, essential to the economy. We may be public servant. We may be a resident, a voter, or protester, all really important roles that people play in their relation to the state. But these are just two. The 20th century was dominated by the market-state battle and completely failed to see two other essential parts of the economy, the household, where we all begin every day. We may be parent or partner, relative or child, that space of unpaid caring work traditionally done by women, but that makes life work and worth living, and that underpins the paid economy. And the commons, where people meet, not through the market or the state, but as a community, where people show up as volunteer, as sharer, as co-creator, as steward, co-creating goods and services they care about. Now, actually, the past year has been really powerful for making these multiple identities visible, because when COVID, literally due to physical distancing, forced shut many market spaces, we saw the rise of key workers and the role of the state in essential state services. And people respected and recognized the essential nature of that foundational economy. We saw the rise of pressure on households caring for ill members, homeschooling children. In some cases, it's led actually to close family experiences. In some cases, it's exacerbated domestic violence, intense pressure on the household, and also the rise of the commons, communities making a WhatsApp group for the street, or setting up a food bank, caring for their neighbors. And one thing that many people worldwide say is, after COVID, what we don't want to lose is that sense of the we of society, the collective. So we need to create economies, whether at the city or national level, or indeed globally, that recognize the multiplicity of these roles, that we move in and out of them, that they all demand space and time in our lives, and that they work best when they work together. So how can cities move into the donut? And this is the final point that I want to make, because we can talk about transforming the design of cities to be regenerative, to be distributive, but what really matters and what makes that possible, what turns the difference between whether it can happen or not, is the deep design of the institutions themselves. So I'm going to again talk about cities, but I invite you to think about this through the level of a national government, or indeed through a business, or indeed through a foundation, an NGO, an institute, a university. The design of our institutions profoundly shapes what we can do and be in the world. So we need to redesign the core institutions. 20th century was very much focused on serving a growth city. And the 21st century needs to be focused on serving a thriving city. That shape of progress has changed. And the 5 design traits that make all the difference into whether or not we can do this, whether we say, how can we make our city grow, or whether we say, how can we make our growing city thrive, those design traits are the purpose, networks, governance, ownership, and finance. And I'll give little examples of each one. So the purpose, what is the purpose of your city? Is it to grow and compete, or is it to thrive and collaborate? Listen to the speeches made by the policymakers. And again, you can think of this through the lens of a government, a national government, or a business, or your own organization. The speech of the CEO. What is the language they use to talk about what success looks like? In the city of Amsterdam, where we've worked, they've embraced the donut as a model for their future and have this new vision of Amsterdam as a thriving, inclusive, regenerative city that meets the needs for all residents while respecting planetary boundaries. That is a 21st century purpose for a city. Now, the other traits need to be aligned with that. So networks. How is your city networked? It can have real impact through using anchor institutions and community wealth building. So recognizing that there are institutions, public-oriented institutions in the city, whether it's the local government, the schools, the hospitals, that are not going anywhere, but are continually going to be purchasing services and food and supplies. Buy them locally. Build local and small and medium enterprise networks. Anchor institutions, as in Preston, as in Cleveland, Ohio, can really make a difference on this. Long-term contracts. Cities can bring together networks of buyers, as did the city of Melbourne, bring 8 to 10 large institutions together, setting a long-term contract offering to buy renewable electricity for 10 years on a fixed price. It enabled a solar farm and a wind farm to be constructed in order to meet that contract. So getting together to make a contract can transform how that contract is met. And then multi-city procurement under the C40, which is a network of almost 100 cities working to bring global heating under 1.5 degrees. Many of those cities came together and collectively procured electric buses. And the scale of their procurement meant the bus companies actually jumped and delivered, instead of saying, well, we won't be able to do that for another 10 years. They said, oh, if the order is that big, we can do that within 5 years. So it can bring forward the future. Governance. How is the city governed? Who has voice? And of course, many more cities around the world are now using citizens' assemblies, deliberative democracy, bringing in the voice of the residents of that place who don't have to get re-elected in 4 years and who can use the diversity of their wisdom and experience to actually deliberate on the transformations they know needs to be brought about. Also, what are the metrics that the city is using and rewarding? The Economy for the Common Good has a table of metrics that it assesses companies by. And in cities like Hamburg, they're now rewarding companies that have undertaken that assessment and have got a good score. And they're now getting a tax deduction or a subsidy, so that some cities are actually actively supporting companies that are very clearly incorporating social and environmental value into the core of their business operations. Ownership. Coming down to the deep stuff now. How is the city owned? What does that mean? How is a city owned? Well, who owns the land and housing? Some cities, the land and housing is almost all privatized. And again, remember Vienna, where actually the vast majority of housing is publicly owned. And that makes all the difference in terms of the equity in the city and the quality of life that it engenders. Who owns the power? Who owns the utilities? Power and water. Places like Omaha, it's a public district and publicly owned utilities bring the revenue and the control back to the community. If we want to transform our energy systems, do we need to transform the ownership of those energy systems so that local cities and governments and communities have a say at the ownership stage of how that transformation takes place? Who owns the data? We all know that the 21st century means data is critical. Who owns that data? The city of Barcelona is committed to an open digital society, making sure that people are sovereign of their data, but that the data is held in a public way. And then businesses. Who owns the businesses that are dominating your city? And what's the relationship that those businesses have? What do they give back to the city? What do they take from it? How can that be transformed? And again, using procurement, anchor institutions can enrich the local social, small and medium enterprise network of businesses in your city. And lastly, let's come down to the deepest one, finance. What role does finance play in your city? What is finance expecting and demanding and driving? Is it aligned with all these other design traits? Where's the city revenue coming from? A large number of cities actually depend a lot for their revenue on car parking charges. So what happens when they start moving cars out? Where instead will they find that revenue? Many cities provide finance to their own citizens, finance that's oriented towards local businesses, Black-owned businesses, community enterprise. Those credit unions can be essential in enabling finance to reach real economy investments in the local community. And then city divestments and investments. What's the city pulling out of? Many cities are now pulling out of holding their public pensions in fossil fuels and investing in renewable futures. So finance, of course, is key at the bottom of that set of transformations, but they all matter. They all need to be redesigned. And again, I invite you, whatever institutions you have a foothold in and influence over, think about these 5 design traits and how they can be redesigned. How can your city best be redesigned to be in service of thriving, or your institution, your university, your own company, your government? These questions are critical. And as people go into brainstorming groups later today, I really invite you to take these design traits into those groups, because this determines what an organization can be and do as part of transformation. So let me finally finish and say that I know that the power of peer-to-peer inspiration is huge. We created a city portrait of Amsterdam through the lens of the Doughnut, and Amsterdam published it in April of 2020 in the height of their COVID infection, because they said, as we emerge from the emergency, who do we want to become? When they published it, and we then published the methodology that we used to create it, so that everybody can see, it's an open tool that everybody can see how we did it. It's now triggered initiatives from governments to communities to universities in cities, towns and countries worldwide. And I keep talking about cities, but it's not just cities. It's happening at the level of neighborhoods like Ladywood in Birmingham. It's happening at the level of nations like Costa Rica. In fact, in my local stationery shop, I found this wrapping paper, and I thought, that's my wrapping paper, with these donuts, whether they're nations or cities or towns or regions or neighborhoods. This thinking, this paradigm of how do we meet the needs of all within the means of the planet, of course, it operates at multiple scales, and that's where we need to put it into practice. If this inspires you, I really invite you to join us in Doughnut Economics Action Lab, where community members are joining us online, co-creating ideas for cities, for governments, for community organizations, for business. We are turning these ideas into practice on the ground, so that we can begin to collectively figure out what it means to bring these ideas to life. And there are lots of stories and tools that have been shared back by members of the community. So if this inspires you, I really invite you to join us in Doughnut Economics Action Lab to do that. But let me finish by saying that today is a day of diving into big ideas and then getting into groups of exploring. And I really hope you'll take some of these ideas in there with you, thinking about the design of the very institutions, drawing down carbon, so that we restore the cycles of the living world and that we can move to meet the needs of all within the means of the living planet. Thank you very much indeed.